Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Vertical Space, a podcast at the intersection of technology and flight. We are your hosts, Jim Barry and Luka Tomjanovic, and here we look at the most important forces shaping the market of advanced air mobility, with a particular focus on why and how they matter to those building a business in this very exciting and growing industry.
I feel that every mature industry, finance, automotive, and all of that, they are all heavily regulated, right? If you create large externalities, pollution, noise, airspace usage, and all of that, you're going to end up being heavily regulated. And if you don't understand that, if you think that you can operate as if you are not creating those externalities, I don't know, if you're a software company that just installed on the computer and works, that's not the way it works, right? This is not the way it's going to be. And the sooner you realize that, the better it is.
Hey everybody, welcome back to The Vertical Space. Today we speak with Lorenzo Murzilli, CEO of Murzilli Consulting and as special advisor to the Swiss Federal Office of Civil Aviation. He leads the Joint Authorities for Rulemaking on Unmanned Systems Working Group on Safety and Risk Management. Lorenzo has also been amongst the founding fathers of the Global UTM Association. Lorenzo has been called the innovative regulator, and you'll discover why as you listen to our podcast. In our talk today, we discuss the state of the drone market in Europe, including the rate of commercial drone adoption, differences between the EU and US, remaining gaps, and the EASA regulations. Listen to Lorenzo's continuous emphasis on and importance of being aware of the hurdles in starting and running a drone business, and his emphasis on embracing and not avoiding those hurdles. And to that end, you'll really enjoy our startup case study, where we conduct a deep dive with Lorenzo into building a drone business in Europe, from idea and CONOPS to design verification and operational approvals. And he discusses the pitfalls and traps you'll want to avoid. Let me tell you a little bit more about Lorenzo. He is a graduated aerospace engineer, innovative manager, and aviation executive with broad expertise in emerging as well as traditional aviation. As I mentioned, he's the founder of CEO of Murzilli Consulting, a digital consulting agency focused on aviation, where Lorenzo works with aviation companies worldwide to turn disruption into profit now. Lorenzo has been appointed as special advisor to the Swiss Federal Office of Civil Aviation, and in this capacity, he leads the Joint Authorities for Rulemaking on Unmanned Systems Working Group on Safety and Risk Management, in charge of developing the specific operations risk assessment. As mentioned, Lorenzo has been amongst the founding fathers of the Global UTM Association, where he was entrusted with the function of treasurer. He's a guest lecturer at the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, mentor of students at Tsinghua University in Chengdu, and was previously with the Swiss Federal Office of Civil Aviation, Leonardo, and Pilatus Aircraft. Lorenzo has developed a striking ability to boost innovation in safety-critical environments and enjoys exploring the intersection of safety and disruptive technologies that can advance the human race forward. Thanks for joining us, Lorenzo. It was a great discussion. And to our listeners, we hope you enjoy Lorenzo's talk as you innovate in the vertical space.
This episode of the Vertical Space podcast is brought to you by UAvionics. UAvionics is the leader in low size, weight, and power certified avionics for manned, unmanned, and advanced air mobility aircraft. Let UAvionics help you achieve your goals, whether that be type certification, airspace access, or beyond visual line of sight operations. UAvionics has certified and certifiable communications, navigation, and surveillance avionics for your aircraft. So head over to uavionics.com or Google it to see how you can start flying safer and move your platform forward into shared airspace. Lorenzo, thank you very much for being here. It's very exciting to have you and to talk about drones and drone businesses, particularly those in Europe. Thank you very much for joining us on the Vertical Space.
And thanks for the invite, and hi, everybody.
To kick off the conversation, tell us, is there anything that very few in the industry agree with you on?
Oh, well, a few things for sure. I mean, I think the thing probably that everybody disagrees with the most is that the industry is very immature. I talk and I consult and I help a lot of people, and everybody's trying to achieve scale and do great things. And I'm sure everybody will get there, or at least most will get there. But the industry is very immature. There is a lot to do to grow the industry before complaining about the regulation. And not many people agree with me with that, but that's what I think.
Any particular areas that you would highlight as pockets of immaturity?
Well, I mean, the two that comes to mind for sure is one is in general the engineering teams, right? I mean, I guess it has to do with the fact that a lot of I'm talking about now young startups, and I'm not talking about necessarily the big already established companies. They come up from a startup environment. I don't make many friends saying that, but several times the CTOs are either founders or friend of the founders, and they grow from this small environment, more small startup environment, into trying and create a product that can be sold and into the aviation system. And the engineering teams have to go through significant transformations along this journey. You know what they say, like what brought you here is not going to bring you there. And this transformation is challenging, that's for sure. The second that comes to mind for also is the appreciation of the complexity of the regulation and the reason why it is complex. You know, many people say, this is too complicated. Why don't you make it simple? And, having been an authority myself on the other side and spent 10 or more years trying to make things simple, this is as simple as it gets, right? It's you can keep asking for simplification, but at a certain point, we need to understand these things are complex, right? And they want to do complex things. And therefore, the investments in regulation, understanding regulation and lobbying for regulation and all of that, in my opinion, is largely underestimated, and it has to be, definitely brought up to scale to what the industry wants to achieve.
All right. Well, we'll come back to some of these points, but let's have a more generic discussion first. How would you characterize the state of the drone market in Europe today?
I mean, it's an interesting topic because, recently we were at the commercial UAV, expo in Las Vegas, right? And I was talking with people around there, and there was a lot of enthusiasm about coming to Europe, right? Coming to Europe and the feeling that the European market and the European framework is somehow ahead of that of the rest of the world when it comes to operating in the so-called specific category, right? So operating somehow BVLOS, right? Let's say BVLOS, just to simplify matters for a second. It seems closer than it is in the rest of the world. And so I see enthusiasm and I see activity around that, of course, with all the challenges involved. On the other side, those who strive in the open category or in the Part 107 environment, for those in the US, they prefer the US system, and they think that market is more developed because somehow Part 107 is simpler than the European open category that has all these classes and subcategories and different requirements for different drones, and it somehow feels bothersome and complicated. So I think in general you would say, if you are up for BVLOS complex operations, probably Europe is a good place to be. If you can make money, in an open category, probably the US is the place to be at the moment.
And you say that Europe seems to be closer to specific or generically speaking BVLOS flight. What makes you suggest that it seems to be that way rather than it is going to happen?
To me, the simplest answer is that the European regulation already has provisions in it to allow BVLOS operations, even autonomy. Everything is in there, right? The regulatory framework is finished, it's developed. What we are working on now are some of the guidance material required, but in general, there is a path. The path is relatively clear. From a regulatory point of view, the creation of use spaces, so the use space regulation, etc., they are all clear path to success. It's all there. Now it's up to the industry to go and take it. In the US, this is not true. I feel that, yes, you can have a type certificate, but what do you do after that? Like, how do you get your operation authorizations to fly in BVLOS? What are all the challenges, regulatory speaking, that have to be addressed? They have not been addressed, in my opinion, as thoroughly as in Europe.
So leading up to where we are in Europe today, when you look back in the recent history, what have been some of the most important milestones?
Well, I mean, obviously, the regulation, the European regulation, the so-called 947 and 945, have been the most important milestones, right? Because that is what actually created the framework that we are living in today. So the open category, okay, with all its complications, but still it's there, right? And then the specific category and the certified category. I would say, I cannot be really objective in this because I had a relatively active role to play into this. But to me, one of the main things, maybe the main things, has been the creation of the specific category as a standalone way of approving operations in that fit in there. And you can understand that in this way. Like, traditional aviation is silos based, right? You have the pilots, you have the operators, you have the aircraft, the flight attendants, and all of these kind of different silos. Everybody has its own approval and its own culture. And so when you want to stand up, if you want to become an airliner, right, at the end of the day, you need 10, 20 different approvals for all these different elements. And the whole paradigm of the specific category was like, we don't want that. It's just one approval. It's one operational approval for everything. And of course, it's difficult to get there. It's not maybe only one, it's 1.5 or 2. But this paradigmatic shift allowed a lot of operations to start to happen quicker than in places where this shift didn't happen. And I think that probably is the number one reason why we are where we are today in Europe.
Can you explain for our audience what the specific category really means?
Yeah, it's everything which is not certified or open. that's how actually it was described. But it's true, pretty much. Like the open category has certain limits, like up to 25 kilos, VLOS and so on and so forth. And if you don't fit those limits, you are in the specific category. Now, you would say, what is the limit between the specific and the certified? Fundamentally, it is if when you do the risk assessment, your risk assessment methodology that EASA introduces tells you that it is too risky to be in the specific, then you are in the certified. Right, and there could be, of course, example of that, like if you carry passengers, like you are in a certified. But in general, like there are some criteria that will put you in the certified, but also anything else that the risk assessment doesn't allow you to perform in the specific will be classified as certified. So it's a very wide range of operations. And
so it's not really a black and white matching of use cases to a category of aircraft. It really requires a deeper look into the air and ground risk to ultimately assess where you land.
Yes.
Where is the demand primarily coming from? And that can be defined either as use cases or countries within Europe, at least that you are observing.
The classical use cases of agriculture, construction, pipeline or infrastructure inspection. This is the classic ones that can be done today, right? Crop spraying in the areas where this is required. They are all use cases that the existing regulation somehow enabled, as I mentioned before, but also for which we start to know how to do those things, right? So when you send in an application to do one of those kind of operations, somehow you know what you need to write in it, and the authorities know how to respond to that. So the demand there is quite good.
So given the use cases, that's interesting. And they sound very similar to here in the United States. How does the European regulatory environment shape the use cases being unique in Europe versus here in the United States?
Yes, well, the main thing is that in Europe, for many of these use cases, you don't need a type certificated aircraft because you are in the specific category, right? So it gets a little bit technical, but basically, if you are in the specific category, you have somehow, let's say, 6 levels that we call SAIL of, call it like of mitigated risk, somehow residual risk that your operation will fit into, right? So you can be a SAIL 1, which is kind of like Europe, we call it low risk operation. I mean, those that, including myself, who know a bit more about these things, say that this is not exactly the way you should call it. But just to simplify matters here, like SAIL 1 and 2 is like low risk, and SAIL 3 and 4 is medium risk, and SAIL 5 and 6 is high risk. It's not really this, but just bear with me for a moment. The idea is if you are in this lower risk area, so SAIL 1 and 2, you don't need a type certificated aircraft. If you are in SAIL 3 and 4, what you actually need is design verified aircraft, which is something slightly different than type certificate. And if you are in 5 and 6 or above, you need a type certificated aircraft. Now, for some of the use cases I mentioned, I don't know, ag inspection or things like that, you almost always end up in a SAIL 2 environment, or you can craft your CONOPS to end up in your SAIL 2 environment. And that means you can operate commercially without a TC. And this is what a lot of people are doing, right? So at the moment, almost all of the operations happening in Europe in the specific category are SAIL 1 and 2. There are, of course, few exceptions, but if you think about more the ones that are happening more at scale, they are SAIL 1 and 2.
And this is as opposed to the situation in the US where if you want to fly beyond visual line of sight and carry somebody else's property for commercial revenues, like a cargo mission of sorts, then you need to have a type certified aircraft.
Yeah, well, you need to be in Part 135, right?
Exactly. So you need
yes.
Part 135, which requires a type certified aircraft.
Exactly. I mean, from mid next year, right? Until now, you could do it with exemptions. And this is how people have been doing it, right? So you have an exemption to the requirement and off you go. But with the exemption regime coming to an end, obviously you will need to get a type certificate, right? So, and that's kind of a barrier to entry also for operations which in Europe could eventually be done in SAIL 2.
So how do you read that? Do you see that as the FAA being more conservative, more safety-centric, or do you see that as trying to fit a manned aviation paradigm into drone operations?
Look, I love the FAA. I have so many friends in the FAA, and many of them have been collaborating with me in the past on, try and break these silo barriers, right? But what I understand is that the legal system in the United States just didn't allow this to happen. So in Europe, we somehow had the luck of having the opportunity to write a new law that says, from now on, this is the specific category. Now, this is how it works, and you don't have to have the TC, right? This is pretty much what the regulation says. And somehow in the US, for whatever reason, this was never possible. And so you are ultimately, it was stuck with the existing framework. So Part 135 is nothing new. It's the same part that applies also to manned aviation. TC is also nothing new. It's the same thing that applies for manned aviation. The mechanism to obtain it, of course, is different, right? And that's fine. I mean, that makes sense. The durability and reliability testing, 2117B and all of that. But ultimately, you get a TC. And so I think that the legal system was different and didn't allow actually the FAA to enact those changes that somehow EASA or the European Commission here in Europe managed to do. Now, exactly why that was, I don't know, but this is the way it looks, at least from my perspective.
So looking across the two continents, the two frameworks in which drone operations are being pioneered, do you see a difference in the progress that the communities are making in each of these geographies based upon these differing regulations?
That's super interesting because I think the world being global, right? I think it's just more challenging for companies to deploy where things can happen. But I mean, we have plenty of European companies that are flying in the open category, for example, in the US, right? And they are very happy with that and make a good revenue. And we have plenty of American companies that are trying to operate in the specific category and in Europe, right? So I'm not so sure if this different framework is really shaping the industry as far as their progress is concerned. It's more shaping like the challenges that they have in finding the right business places to do business independently where they are located, if you know what I mean.
And in the past, prior to this unified European regulation, I think there was a trend where drone companies in Europe did not really want to engage in this patchwork of regulatory situations across the European continent, and couple that with a smaller market than it exists in the US. A lot of these companies came to the US looking for business. But now it seems like the situation is a little bit turned around almost, where this unified regulatory framework does allow a lot more streamlined scaling of companies throughout the European continent. Would you say that this is true, or is there still, or how really unified these regulations are? To what extent will individual national authorities still have freedom to impose certain nuances?
Yeah, I mean, now I need to be careful about the answer, So, if I want to be official, it is unified because actually the law requires it to be, right? So it's not like something that you can choose to change. The different European authorities have to adopt the European regulation, and therefore by law they are required to act accordingly, and so they are doing. Now, of course, I would say the early experience of those who are trying to operate cross-country with approvals issued from individual member states to other countries, I would say they are reporting that what is the local conditions that, of course, the regulation allow to apply one nation to apply over approvals issued in another nation, can be abused, right? And all the way to I almost need you to do the approval from scratch, right, because of local conditions. And I mean, this is, I think it's a kind of a infancy problem. It's a matter of building trust between each other authority and making sure that you can really believe that what others have done is done properly, and you can allow operation in your country. So I would say in this infancy phase, some of the mechanisms that are in place are not working exactly as planned, but I'm pretty confident this is going to go away because European authorities have a history of very good collaboration. There are several places in which they meet and they talk and they collaborate, and so I guess these wrinkles are going to be ironed out in a few probably months or years.
Who are some of the countries that are most forward-leaning and which are the most conservative?
I cannot talk about the most conservative without making enemies of my friends, but I can talk about the most forward-leaning for sure, right? So, I mean, of course, Switzerland. I mean, I cannot not mention Switzerland. That's where I live. That's the authority that I have been somehow leading until my departure from it in 2020, and I guess that's definitely a very forward-leaning country. I cannot not mention Ireland. Of course, you've seen recently Wing deploying in Ireland. Of course, we have Manna there. Nations like Malta, which is trying to punch almost bigger than their weight when it comes to try and support operations and trying to find the place for themselves in this ecosystem. And I think they're doing a good job there. And I mean, of Spain, it's a very, very interesting country. They are very advanced when it comes to several things, and like test center and also somehow guidance for operators that are trying to do the right thing. So that's definitely an interesting country as well, and many more. But I mean, I've just now picked the top four. I put it this way.
So let's say I'm heavily invested in the drone market, whether it be the vehicles or the services in Europe. And I'm listening to this podcast, and it sounds really interesting, and you're talking about the regulatory environment and the like. But at the end of the day, I want to be able to make sure I get the most bang for my buck, and I tap the rivers of cash where the opportunities are to be able to make money as a result of the drones or the drone services. Where are the rivers of cash today that have not been tapped because of the regulatory environment in Europe?
I would say urban delivery. Delivery, everything which happens in cities. I would say that's definitely one that is there, ready to take if the industry and the operators do the right job. When I mention cities, I mean, like you can imagine not only the delivery, really like the coffee delivery, but also I would say, the medical delivery, the labs network, and all of that is definitely untapped. So I would say, you remember before I was talking about Sail 2 as being now the norm in Europe, and Sail 3 and Sail 4 becoming it's the next exploration. Anything that is in Sail 4 is ready to be captured as soon as the industry and the operators learn how to deal with it.
We had Jim from Matternet on last week or a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the use case for Matternet, I mean, when it comes to labs and organs and personalized chemo and personalized treatment, you would think that is a huge opportunity to be able to help the industry and make money. But what you're saying is there's still a lot to be done for a Matternet, for example, to be able to operate within the cities, to be able to get its greater economic value.
What's funny about this is, like, I approved the Matternet operator, or was part of the team as well, when they started to operate in Switzerland, in Lugano or in Zurich, right? And actually, it was plenty of years ago. And they are flying over Zurich, right? They were flying over Lugano. It was a BVLOS operation over a city. And the challenge is that is one route or two routes or three routes, right? And the river of cash doesn't come from one or two or three routes. It comes from being able to operate from a network. Right. So the scale is the problem, right? The challenge is you can do a Sail 2 operation for routes that you can craft very carefully, but it doesn't work when you just want to fly over a city. That goes very quickly up, right? And so when you goes very, very quickly up, even in Europe, the requirements go very, very quickly up. And again, and it's up to the companies to be able to deal with them.
Is the value proposition among enterprises in Europe well understood? And how would you describe the drone adoption rates among European enterprises across various use cases?
That's super interesting. I don't think it's well understood. I think there is a gap in understanding, because some of the users, they are still far away from the industry, and the industry is still unable to serve those users. I mean, I'm thinking about if you want to do last mile delivery from a trucking company, like if I'm a big trucking company and I want to understand how can drones help me to improve my business, I'm not so sure that the value is understood there, and I'm not so sure that there are companies offering clear value proposition there, just because, again, they're stuck into this regulatory growth problem. And until they solve that, they cannot really go and offer any value, right? Because again, it's going to be a proof of concept that, it ends there. So I don't think that the market penetration rate is very high at the moment. Actually, I think it's quite low for some of these more complex use cases. And I really believe that the industry needs to do a better job in explaining the use cases and as well getting the approvals. Therefore, working and, graduating from the lower sales to the higher sales.
And how would you do that if you had a drone business? How would you make sure that the value prop is communicated in a way that it matters?
Well, I mean, that's really in my opinion, is difficult, because it's how can you be credible, right? I mean, if I cannot offer you this value today because I don't get the approvals, I cannot actually come to you and say, look, tomorrow I'll show you how it works and offer the value. I think that the credibility is very, very low. So it's kind of a chicken and egg. First you need to manage to get where you need to be in order to offer that value proposition, and then you can go and offer it. I mean, an example where I think value is clear, if you do, for example, a ship to shore, right? I mean, this to me seems an area where, it's very difficult for not to understand that a drone can bring a part, outside, out on offshore, cheaper than a vessel. And even you are over the sea, so your sail is lower, right? And it's very easy to say, like, look, I can get the permission to do that. I can fly out and deliver your part, and it costs you, I don't know, half or even less than half than what you would cost normally. That's easy. But if I want to go and say to a lab, hey, this is my value proposition when it comes to, operating a network of, I don't know, vaccine deliveries or whatever, yeah, I can do a proof of concept that works, but how do I scale from there, right? So I think my strategy would be get the approvals first and then go and offer the value. But I need money for that, right? And that's why I'm not doing it.
Lorenzo, with the potential that Sale4 operations offer, from the perspective of a regulator, where are they focused? What are the key things that they're paying attention to that are going to be instrumental to getting that type of approval, seeing that happen?
I would say there are two things right now. Number one is the actual aircraft, the vehicle, the UAS, I would say, because at that level of sale has some sort of an implied level of safety behind that cannot be achieved unless you go through a very rigorous design process that somehow culminates with what the EASA calls a design verification. But I mean, you can see it as a TC without organizational requirements. So it's a rigorous design process that cannot be improvised. And so authorities are looking into that very, very deeply to make sure that ultimately we are approving, safe machines. That's one thing. And the other thing is that you need to, again, these deliveries, all of these operations happen in airspace, right? And the airspace, you cannot just shut it down while you do your testing, so you need to integrate into the airspace while the airspace is still being used by all the incumbents, and you need to do that in a safe way. And obviously that's a big challenge, right? It is a big challenge because despite the fact that it is a big blue sky and, when you look up, there are not too many aircraft around, when you start to operate at scale, there will be quite a lot of aircraft around that you will encounter during your operations, and you need to manage that. So the management of the air risk, it's to be the biggest challenge. Europe is answering to that with the notion of use space and saying, hey, it's true, but we can establish use spaces where the businesses are if those businesses can be enabled by a use space. And in a use space, the air risk can be managed much easier than outside of the use space. And that's the promise, right? So the promise is we're going to build use spaces and right there where, for example, the Matternet of the world or the Manna of the world need to operate. And in those use spaces, the risk will be lower. However, the use space, for example, it's a complex matter again. It's up to the member states to establish them, risk assessment, all the, we can talk about this forever, but that's definitely an area of focus. So I would say, yeah, the machine and the air risk.
So by use space, you mean an airspace in which UAS systems can operate and they are offered a set of services for traffic information, for some level of deconfliction and situational awareness, as well as perhaps weather, remote identification, and some of the others, right?
Yes, you summed it up perfectly, but I would add two things to that. If you think about a use space as an airspace, which it is, right? You can set up one in controlled airspace and an uncontrolled airspace, in principle. And if you set up one in controlled airspace, the airspace being controlled, the risk of collision is somehow minimized by the fact that there is a controller, right? And therefore the entire airspace is under, and there is no uncooperative traffic, which is unknown to the controller. When you are in an uncontrolled airspace, this is not true. There could be uncooperative traffic. Today, actually, there is a lot of it. And that's where the use space kicks in. And with the amendment of the regulation, especially of the rules of the air, what the European did is said, like, if I set up a use space in an uncontrolled airspace, any manned aircraft that want to fly in it needs to be conspicuous. And so somehow it eliminates the notion of uncontrolled or unconspicuous airplanes operating within a use space. And therefore, this simplifies matters a lot because, as you know, detect and avoid efforts are not really progressing at the speed of light. And therefore, the use space is trying to kind of shortcut that problem and say, well, there is not going to be anybody uncooperative in a use space. So let's start there, right? Mm-hmm. And that's kind of an important thing.
It is because especially in the US, it's a big point of contention, this uncooperative traffic detection. And it almost appears that somebody who owns a Piper Cub from the 70s without an electrical system and therefore cannot carry an ADS-B on board is somehow slowing down the entire drone industry.
Yeah, I think okay, you can put it this way, and I think, again, you're not going to make too many friends in the GA community, but that's fine. But on the other side, it's kind of like you want to create equipage requirements really where it's necessary, right? So if you imagine the Piper Cub example, if you go out there and say, you Piper Cub owners, you have to equip now, in general, right? This might be seen almost as an abuse in the sense as like, but what if I'm flying where there is no drones? Like, why do I need to equip? While the idea behind the use space is that I create a use space because there are a lot of drone operations in the area, right? And so at that point, suddenly it becomes very obvious why you need to equip, right? Because now you want to fly inside an area where we know it's full of drones. And so that is much easier to digest than a blanket statement everybody has to equip.
So before we go into the case study, what gaps do you see exist in the drone market, European or otherwise?
Maybe I'm going to say something surprises to you. I think the industry is not advertising itself enough. It's not a technology thing. Of course, there are all those gaps you mentioned, but if I think about the most mature industry, the car industry, the consumer technology industry, right, the powerful associations, and they create awareness around what they do, why they are important, the role they play for the society in a very, very strong way. From making movies where you show cars, right, to organizing CES in Las Vegas. And I think the drone industry is still kind of like inside a little bit in a cave. And it's like, yeah, somebody's going to notice us, but they are so far away from this most established industry that go out there and push and say, here I am, and here is the value I provide.
So Lorenzo, if you were going to create a 30-second spot, a 30-second commercial, and you were going to put it before a huge audience, let's say the United States Super Bowl, what would be the 30-second spot for the drone industry for it to properly advertise?
I think if you think about what was this spot, with the unfortunate situation of the COVID-19, you would see drones coming up to the rescue or somehow trying to support, delivery of vaccine, delivery of goods to people with COVID and stuff like that. And people started to notice drones as like, hey, this is kind of a positive thing, right? So I would really start to look into what is the value that as an industry we are offering, and then start to highlight this value. And unfortunately or fortunately, there are a lot of these. I mentioned, delivery of parts, delivery of medical networks, and all of these kind of things. Also, I would say, focus on sustainability or improved level of safety compared to ground transportation. All of these kind of things, they are real, right? I think they can be proven, and we can definitely push those as well. But so I would kind of put all this together. I don't have a 30-second answers. I mean, but it's.
I like that though. We had a guest on about a month ago who talked about parts of advanced air mobility he really liked and some he didn't like as much. But the healthcare use case is really interesting. And let's face it, if you were able to map a city and see the number, for example, of couriers driving all around in their cars, and the time it takes, the unpredictability of it all, and then be able to show how it could be done by drones, to be able to show the green effect as a result. But also there's a heck of a lot of use cases in healthcare, again, with personalized medicine, for example, laboratory organs and the like, where there's a great value to the person and to the society as a result of it. So I think that's, that could be part of your spot. I like it.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is the most disappointing aspect of the drone market in Europe?
To me, or in general? It's like
well, let's start with you, but I'm curious in general as well.
I don't know. To me, I would say, I think, again, coming back to my criticism sometimes to the industry, to the maturity of the industry, is that I don't think that the industry has understood deeply how progressive and how much efforts the regulators have put in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years to get them to fly. I think this is very disappointing because people complain all the time. But, if you go back, and I was there, if you go back in 2015, 2014, and you look at the regulatory framework which was there, you pretty much you were grounded. That's it. You had to go through the whole, manned aviation certification process. There was no chance for you to fly. And to be honest, the industry was so small and immature that there was almost no real interest from the big authorities to move from from there. And at the beginning, it was a small group of people, literally, I can name them one by one, that get together and say, hey, we got to do something about this, and started to really work and break down those walls and those barriers, without really having too much industry pressure, too much lobby pressure. They really did it because they believed in it. And, fast forward 5 years later, we have this amazing regulation, in my opinion. Okay, complicated, cumbersome, whatever it is. But hey, now you can fly. Now you can make a business. And I don't think people understand how complex, how long, and how demanding that effort was.
That's well put. Let's go into our case study. For that, Lorenzo, please take us on a journey of starting a drone business in Europe. And so let's say that the four of us come together. We see a market opportunity in, pick a random use case. You mentioned ship to shore previously. So let's choose ship to shore, delivery of mail and small cargo packages. And then let's further say that we believe that we can maintain and stay below 25 kilograms or 55 pounds in max weight. And let's also say that our concept of operation involves flying mostly over water, but we need to fly through controlled airspace at some point on our routes. And because we're not taking off right at the beach, there are some roads and urban areas that we need to fly over. And then we determined that, there are no adequate drones in the market that we can just buy off the shelf. So we'll need to make our own. So that's our mission. That's our concept of operations. That's our business opportunity. Where do we start? What do we do next?
That's a good one. So I would say there are several aspects to this challenge that are happening in parallel, right? So you have the money challenge. So I need to start to look for investors, right? And I have the technology challenge because you just told me I need to build my drone. And I have the business case or the business challenge that somehow connects the two together, right? So now, one of the things that I noticed straight from the beginning is that if I need to build an aircraft, I need to understand what the requirements to build this aircraft are, right? You cannot just do one. And if you look at the highest level, when I am thinking of developing a craft, I need to know what are the business requirements, I need to know what are the regulatory requirements, and I need to know what are the safety requirements that apply to that craft. Now, the challenge that we have with this use case is that those three things change over time. So if you think about, I need to raise money, of course, I need to have my business plans and everything else. It's very important, but I forget about very, very early stage. If I start to move a little bit, I have my plans, I have my ideas, as you mentioned already. I got my seeds and stuff like that. Now I want to do a proof of concept, right? To get my Series A, I need to get money. I need to do proof of concepts. And I can do proof of concepts with, pardon my French, pretty crappy aircrafts, right? Business requirement to a proof of concept is almost nothing. Regulation, I can do it somewhere where the regulation doesn't really apply. And from a safety perspective, I can keep it very safe by, I say, flying over water and something like that. And so I develop my proof of concept with an aircraft that almost certainly is not going to be the one that I need to develop, deploy in operation. I think this early stage of the story, with me setting up my, my early engineering team, starting to code and starting to produce in kind of a semi-garage setting, what I need to produce to get this proof of concept, go out there, find my first operator that likes me, if I do ship to shore, I can find oil rigs or whatever, I don't know. All of this can be done in what I call kind of almost in a self-serving state, where you get your money and you just do whatever you think is right. And you don't really have too many interfaces outside of yourself. And to get to the point where you say like, hey, I proved my point, right? Let's say this is my first part of the journey. I got my, almost sale 1 approval. I got my few initial millions. I have a team of 10, 20 people. I have something that kind of flies, and I am doing that. And I think this phase is where a lot of companies are today. We are in Europe, right? A lot of companies have done that. And now, however, you have proven your point. And now you want to switch into like, I want to now scale. And I think here,
and Lorenzo,
yes,
before let's make a couple of simplifications along the way, because I'd like us to peel a few additional layers to this very interesting and complex onion. Let's say that our proof of concept did indeed use an off-the-shelf drone, and that was done for purposes of just showing the business value both to the customers that we have been talking for the last 6 months, but also our investors. So we take one of those drones and we set up a POC that connects a non-populated island to a ship that is somewhere off the coast of that island. And everybody sees the value. We get the investor capital, and we get the partner who signs up and says, yes, I want that, but I want this in front of the marina in this town of 200,000 people.
Yes.
So now you mentioned sale levels. At what point do we sit down and reference the SORA, the Specific Operations Risk Assessment document, which you, I think, led the development on,
yes,
to determine the sale level? And then based on that, how do we then make sure that we design the appropriate aircraft?
All right, this is to me the key moment of the journey, right? Because you now mentioned, I have done my proof of concept, I've done all of that, and now I need to fly in front of a marina. So now suddenly my business requirement change, correct? Like I'm not anymore doing the proof. Now I have to do the real thing. And when I start to write down those business requirements on a piece of paper, I need to understand that, I said it to you before, what brought me here is not going to bring me there. My 25 engineers in a garage are not going to bring me to that business case. And why is that? Because when you write down your business cases and you start to write down your CONOPS and you start to write down your regulatory requirements, that's where you start to understand, oh, wait a minute, this is now a Sale 4. This is now an aircraft that has to be design verified. This is now an operation that involves, controlled airspace and, airmanship and all of these different things. And that's not something that I can do at scale with what I have right now.
Yeah, so let's hover on that point a little bit and say that we have come to the realization that we do fall under Sale 4. We will need to go through a design verification. We need to hire a team that actually knows what they're doing and is tuned into the realities of the regulated aviation environment. What does that process then look like? How do we get the the drone through that design.
I think the first thing is gonna have to go to speak to your investors and say, hey, do you understand this? Because a lot of time I hear people say like, but if I do what you tell me to do, my investor's not gonna like it. Like they want to see the result in the next 3 months or the next 6 months, and you're like, this is not about that anymore. Like
Lorenzo, if I may, Lorenzo, didn't your investors know from the very beginning that eventually you're going to have to, rather than be on an island, you're going to have to be flying over the marina?
If you are a good and smart investor, you should know from the beginning, but not everybody knows from the beginning.
Right.
So that's kind of my problem, right? Because sometimes you can like ride on the enthusiasm of the proof of concept, thinking that the next step is just an evolution from there.
Yes.
But it's not an evolution from there at all. The next step is almost a different company.
So how long is that process? Let's say that we do have this realization. We go in front of our investors to say, hey, we'll need to go and get a design verification for a sale for operation aircraft. You can expect an X timeline.
Yeah.
What is that X?
So the answer to this is a little bit tricky. Let me explain you why. Because you could do things in the right way or in the right order or not, right? So imagine that we discussed until now, you arrive all the way to this proof of concept, maximizing the speed for proof of concept, right? So you have actually your garage and your 25 people that are acting in a semi-organized way, but not so much, right? And you do that because you want to get to the proof of concept. So when you come to the realization, again, you should have come before, but when you come to the realization that this is no longer applicable, now you have 2 things you need to do. You need to change your organization before you can start to tackle the design of the aircraft. You cannot go through a design verification with the same people or the same organization that brought you to the POC. And the time it takes you to change the organization is actually what is causing delays to a lot of companies today, because if your culture is very strong already and you already have a very strong, let's say, startup-y, software-based, fail fast and, kind of culture, it's very, very difficult now to say to them, okay, forget about that. Now you need to become a manned aviation or a crewed aviation organization. You have a significant amount of time ahead of you to make that change. So you, in theory, if you do it well, you should prevent this from happening. You should already from the time of the proof of concept have an organization which is structured in a better way, even if this means a slower proof of concept. And this is what, again, talking to your investors is about. If you have been honest in the beginning and say, hey, maybe I need 6 months more, but I'm going to do it with an organization that I can move over to the DV environment faster, then in my opinion, the overall time, it's faster. Because a design verification, it shouldn't take you more than a year or 2 if you do it well. But unfortunately, it will take for a lot of companies much more than that because of the fact that the organization is not up to the challenge, right? And so at that point, it could take you 4 or 5 years, and it is entirely your fault as a company, or it would be my fault in that case.
So for our business, for the 4 of us who've put this company together, is there a partnering opportunity then? Is there an opportunity here with more sophisticated companies out there that have already done it, Lorenzo?
I think that establishing an organization that can sustain at scale, operation in that context, it's not necessarily so difficult. It just needs the acceptance of the fact that it is needed. And this acceptance, it's very, very challenging when you are in a startup kind of mentality. So it's a realization. I need something that resembles a design organization. I need something that resembles a production organization. I need to understand how these things work because I'm developing now a product, right? It's a product with all of what it takes. Now, when it comes to design, you could indeed collaborate with some of the existing, more established organizations. Although I have to say that the cultural clash and the lack of competence of the established ones is actually a problem. So if you're talking about me in my use case, I would definitely not do that. I would definitely do the design organization in-house and build that organization according to the best practices that I know. When it comes to production, however, This is not the same case. Production, you can definitely partner with those that know how to produce, that have done it for multiple years, and that can guarantee you a certain level of quality and conformity. And so that is something that you will have to decide really based on where you are, right? Do you have the skills around you to build up a production organization, or should you just make an agreement with one?
Lorenzo, can you explain the design verification process? What exactly is it? Why do we need it? And what are the steps involved?
Yes, so the design verification process, as the name says, is a verification of the design. So it implies two things: design and verification. So first of all, you need to have a design. What this means is, and this is crucial, it's not to have an aircraft that flies around. A design, in the context of a design verification, is a set of approved design data and production instructions that you can give to a production organization that can build the craft, plus all the necessary test reports, etc., that prove ultimately the design is safe. So the design verification process starts with the idea that I need to have in mind what I want to design. I need to understand what is my aircraft, what are the requirements, as I mentioned before, and how am I going to do that? Against which requirements I need to show compliance to, and then go to the authority and saying, look, authority, I am trying to design this type of vehicle. I think that the applicable requirements I need to show compliance to are those, and you tell me if I'm right or not, and let's agree on a plan on how we're going to do this together. And the authority will basically tell you two things. To say, well, send us as much information as you have about your aircraft, and then we're going to do a familiarization meeting where we sit down with all the experts involved, and you're going to tell us kind of what you want to do, like system by system in detail. Once we understand that, we're going to review your proposal of a certification plan or a design verification plan, and we're going to agree with you whether what you wrote in there is correct or not. So if you say, I don't know, I want to prove the structural requirement by flight testing, is it okay or not? And the authority might say, no, you have to do it by, I don't know, analysis or things like that. And you spend some time in agreeing on this paper, which is called design verification plan, until you can sign off on it. And it's almost like a contract, right? You say, me and you, authority, agree that this is what you're gonna do. These are all the documents I'm gonna send you. This is all the documents you're gonna want to review. You can be involved in witness testing or whatever it is, and this is all agreed in this plan. Once the plan is agreed, it's about doing what's written in the plan, right? So you enter into this so-called compliance showing phase, where you as a company needs to show compliance with all the requirements in the way that is written in the plan. And you send all the information, documentation, testing, whatever, the authority witnesses and comments, all of this, until you get to a point where there are no more open action items, or only a few that can be closed later. And the authority says, okay, that's good. Given that this design is now frozen, you get your design verification. So basically they will tell you, you need to tell me, company, what is the set of drawings, again, and instructions that define the aircraft that you are trying to design verify. And provided that all the tests that you have done, all the information you have provided is reflective of that, I give you a design verification for that design, that specific design. And after that, you can go and build it in a production organization. So that's kind of the process. You can almost imagine these 4 phases of familiarization, agreement on certification, design verification plan, compliance showing, and then the issuing of a DV and all the post-DV action item. That's kind of how it works.
Very good. Thank you. And is this process completely clear as it exists today? Are there any gaps in terms of means of compliance or otherwise?
Yes. So the process is clear. The means of compliance are not fully defined. And this is the work which is currently going on, in several projects, even one in which I am involved with, which is called the Shepherd, which is basically the idea is like, we know what the requirements are. They exist, especially for the small drones, for the specific category, say specific category, medium risk or high risk. We know the requirements. You have a so-called special condition light UAS. Even for VTOL, you have, which is not a design verification. But let's say for design verification, special condition light UAS, it exists. You go there, you see all the requirements are written down. What is not yet written down are all the means to comply with the requirement. And that is the part where there is work to be done. Now, what is interesting about this is that on the one hand, the authority needs to tell you what they are in terms of AMC or guidance material. On the other hand, many times in the past, if you see or for traditional aviation, a lot of those means of compliance refer to standards. And standards are not written by the authority. Standards are written by the industry. So we are kind of in a situation where, yes, as an industry, we can definitely complain to the authority that some of those guidance material is not out there. But at the same time, we can also complain with ourselves that we didn't really make incredible progress when it comes to standards in support of those guidance materials in AMC, right? So it's kind of like, I would say, half and half, although not everybody would agree with me. But if you allow me a simple example, it's like the parachute standard in the US, right? At the end of the day, it's an ASTM standard, and now that you have it, you can use it to comply. But somebody had to develop that standard, and that was not the FAA. Of course, the FAA contributed, but it was not the FAA.
What are the areas where these means of compliance are still being discussed?
There are quite a few, I have to say. There are quite a few. A lot of them are open, to be honest. I wouldn't even be able to tell you one specific area because in general, everything is quite open. But that doesn't mean you cannot progress with the DV. Again, because as I mentioned, there is a lot to do before, right? So while the means of compliance, the GM gets written and discussed and standards are being created, you can still progress with your DV in terms of, familiarizing, starting to write the plan. So there is a kind of an overlapping phase that you can still make good progress with.
So Lorenzo, let's say that we have gotten through the DV process. We have the DV in the pocket. What else do we need to do before we can start operating at scale?
Well, the thing is now when you have a DV, what you basically have in Europe is the proof that your aircraft doesn't have to be further checked by any national aviation authority that will give you the specific operation approval, like the operational approval. Now, what you need to do is to ask for the operational approval to the authority in which you're operating. So say that you are in Ireland and you want to do your ship to shore from there, you're going to go to the IAA and apply for a specific operation approval. And if that operation approval is a Sale 3 or a Sale 4, at that point, you will also say to the Irish authority, and I have a DV, therefore you don't have to check my aircraft. That's already done. What you need to check is everything else. Therefore, my pilot competence, my operator competence, my, all of the other non-technical related mitigations and approvals that you need. And so you need to go through the SORA approval with the local authority, so in this case, Ireland, as in the example, again, waived from any need to show technical compliance because your aircraft has been DV'd. And that could also be a significant process in terms of you need an operator manual, you need the training manual, you need your safety manuals, and all of that has to be created in support of that specific operation approval. But once you get that approval, well, then you can start to operate.
And what do you think are some of the overlooked difficulties that lie in between the receipt of design verification and operations at scale that are within the control of a particular business?
I think it's almost always the air risk problem, right? Because the air risk problem is somehow specific to where you are operating, unless you are so good, but this is kind of things in the future where you can almost operate integrated. But that's not something that you can solve as a single company, right? This is something that the system has to solve in itself. But so I think that the major hurdle will be to have an air risk concept which is strong enough to be able to, let's say, pass scrutiny in all the areas in which you want to operate at scale. Otherwise, every time you want to do a new route, you're going to have to repeat your air risk process, and that's very cumbersome, right? So that you want to solve.
So if I recall from the SORA, there's two levers that one can pull. One is the strategic, where you choose a time at which there's less participation in the airspace by traditional manned aviation, or you are procedurally somehow separating yourself or isolating as much as possible. So that would be one lever. And then whatever risk remains, you mitigate with tactical
Correct
measures. So what are What are the tactical means of mitigating this residual air risk?
Yeah, well, this is the famous discussion about detect and avoid. That would be the immediate one that comes to mind. You could say, yeah, I can detect and avoid. That's how I do it tactically. But whether this means exist to you, that's a different story. Now, the other thing is that you don't necessarily have to detect and avoid by a single system, right? You could detect in a way and avoid in another. You can even avoid manually, right? If you would be good enough to do that. So from this perspective, the idea, for example, of having a radar infrastructure that allows you to detect everybody and then take action when a conflict exists is appealing to some, right? You have acoustic means to detect intruders that you can then, and so that's why you need to be creative, and it becomes really, again, in absence of a solution which is standardized and light enough to be installed on my small delivery drone. This is an area which is, again, far from being standardized, right? So you need to be creative, and you need to really look at your specific use case and figure out, does it make sense for me to, install a network of radars? Or is it better if I put a noise sensor or whatever else that makes sense and optimize for your specific use case? And as you see, why this doesn't really scale well, right? It's still kind of like clunky in its nature.
What's the more understood part, the detect piece or the avoid piece?
That's a very good question. I think the avoid piece is very well understood if you're talking about, let's say, a one-to-one encounter, right? That's not a big issue. I think it gets a little bit trickier if you're talking about, if you have 10 encounters at the same time, what do you need to do in that case? And the rules of avoidance, they are not something, again, you can decide by yourself, right? So do I go up, do I go down, do I go left or right? Depends on the encounter. And these things are not very clearly defined.
And does the SORA make accommodations to the speed of the aircraft and whether it's a fixed wing or a multi-rotor aircraft? So meaning you don't necessarily need to have the level of awareness of the traffic behind you if you're a fast fixed wing UAS.
I would say this is an area that I have learned on my skin gets extremely complicated, extremely technical, extremely fast. Right. Every time I have tried in my past, if you look at the first version of the SORA, the air risk was dealt in a very simplistic way, right? In an attempt to simplify matters, I got always slapped in the face by the experts and say, like, what are you doing? This is way more complex than that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So whenever it comes to what is that you need to do to mitigate this tactically the air risk, I have almost like now a deep respect for how difficult this is technically. And I always say to the people, like, I need to speak with my expert on this, right? This is not an area where I want to start to talk about, because it's so complex and it's so quickly you're going to start to say something wrong. And I don't want to say something wrong.
Okay, to wrap up our case study, let's say that now we have gone through additional steps in the process and building an aircraft, and we put additional sensors on the aircraft to mitigate the air risk, and now we're above 55 pounds and over 25 kilograms. What do we do now? Do we need to go get a type certification instead of a design verification?
No, this 25 kilograms is not a problem at all, because you are operating the specific. The specific is not really weight limited. So your approval is valid at 25 or 29 or 32. It doesn't matter. So you don't have to do nothing. You just need to update your case, and that's it.
Excellent.
One thing maybe before we leave that I wanted to mention is that when you are trying to scale, one thing that you will figure out very quickly is that the governance layer of that somehow regulates the operation that you're trying to do is deeper than just aviation. So I think on top of everything else that we discussed, which is very aviation centric, we need to concern ourselves also with the ground infrastructure, the noise issues, the social acceptance of what I'm trying to do. And the fact that I might have to speak with authorities such as, the telecommunication authority or the city in which I'm trying to operate, right? Or that are non-traditional aviation players, and that I might find very confusing because they are a lot non-coordinated. So there is an element there of, like, how do I understand this governance layer before it hits me back, right? And I think this is something we need to do probably I should have mentioned before, while we are developing our sale cases and stuff like that, mapping the governance layer of my operation really at 360 degrees and making sure that we have an answer for all of those and not only for the aviation part.
And Lorenzo, as an angel investor yourself, do you believe that investors have a good appreciation of all the layers that have to be addressed beyond the vehicle itself as they make their first investments let's say in a drone company, given our case study?
I think some investors are really good at mapping that landscape, and they are very good at having the right experts on board, that help. Others, I would say, less. So I don't think there is a generic answer. I know that some are very, very good and they have the right people, and others not.
With Murzilli Consulting, Lorenzo, you're an outsourced regulatory department, is what you call it on your website. Great website, great company.
Thanks.
What's the most typical question you hear when somebody calls you up and let's say they're in the drone business?
I would say the most common one is definitely what I call regulatory pathway optimization. Basically, people want to understand, how do I get from A to B? And how do I navigate the challenge of regulation given what I want to do? That is definitely the one thing that almost everybody asks. And I think from there, when you start to understand the path, right, and you start to lay down the road and the journey you need to follow, then all the other individual projects come up, right? Oh, okay, I need to do a sale. I need to do a POC. Oh, that's a sale too. Okay, I need to do now a design. I need to organize my engineering in a certain way. Okay, I help you with that. So then, but the beginning is always like, what's the path? Almost like what we did now with this use case, right? It's kind of the same thing. People come and say, this is what I want to do. How do I do this in the most optimized way?
So if we fast forward 5 to 10 years, what do you think the industry looks like?
No, I would love to it looks awesome, right? I mean, I would like to see a mature industry, right? So less atomized for sure, more aware, more able to make itself heard where it matters, with use cases that are beyond those that are currently available, with crafts that are being certified or design verified, and with operations that have been approved under SAIL 4, and with the use cases that are making money, right? And therefore, creating a market for this industry to exist. So I think 5-10 years, especially, let's say non-AAM, if I'm thinking about, the drones in the open specific category, that's definitely a time frame which is achievable.
And in order to be able to tap as we said, the rivers of cash, more likely we're going to be operating over cities to be able to get the greatest value out of the drone businesses.
Yes, I totally think so. Yes.
What advice, Lorenzo, would you give to someone who wants to start a business in the drone market?
Understand the regulation. This is it. You need to understand the regulation. I always say imagine if somebody would ask you the question, what advice would you give to somebody that wants to start a business in nuclear power plant environments, right? You would tell them, like, look, this is a safety thing. You need to understand the regulation, right? And and to be honest, I feel that every mature industry, finance, automotive, and all of that, they are all heavily regulated, right? If you create large externalities, pollution, noise, airspace usage, and all of that, you're going to end up being heavily regulated. And if you don't understand that, if you think that you can operate as if you are not creating those externalities, I don't know, if you're a software company that just installed on the computer and works, that's not the way it works, right? This is not the way it's going to be. And the sooner you realize that, the better it is.
Very well said. Is there something that jumps out as the most common misconception or misunderstanding?
The most common misunderstanding, I think it's on the rapidity of the execution. I think in general, people tend to believe that things are faster than they are. And they tend to believe that the reason why they are slower when they actually find out that they are slower is because the authorities, is because the regulation, is because of this and that. And actually, I think the only reason is that you didn't plan it properly. And again, you underestimated some of those hurdles, and ultimately they are biting you back, right? So I don't think that the regulation or the authorities, I mean, not all the time. Of course, sometimes they are responsible for the delays, and I'm very critical when this is the case. But in many other times, they are not responsible, and it's actually you are responsible for your own delays.
Lorenzo, somebody approaches you and said, "Hey, I heard you were on the Vertical Space podcast. What did you talk about? How would you summarize it in a minute?"
Well, I think we did a very nice conversation around, around Europe and the US, and how the two compare and contrast when it comes to the regulatory environment. We talked about business. We talked about, how to start a business in the drone world. How will the journey look like, and what are the pitfalls, the traps that you might want to avoid. Yeah, and it was a nice chat with a great bunch of folks.
And what would be one point you would want to leave with our audience?
Be mindful, I would say. Just be mindful. If you are talking drones, just be mindful of all the complications around you and embrace those, and not just try to avoid them.
Lorenzo, it's always a pleasure talking to you, and I had a lot of fun in this conversation. So thank you for being so patient and for honoring us with your time. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you to you guys. It was a great chat indeed, and thanks for the invite.
The same, Lorenzo. It's always a very revealing discussion when we get together. So thank you for that.
All right, that's a wrap for today. Thank you for listening to the Vertical Space Podcast. Reach out if there are topics that you would like us to discuss, and goodbye until the next episode. Unless mentioned, this podcast is in no way endorsing or promoting any person and or company mentioned, and all opinions within the podcast are solely that of the presenters. The Vertical Space makes no guarantees, warranty, or representation of any information given in this podcast. Any information given is for informational purposes and should be used at your own risk. This podcast is for general, educational, and entertainment purposes only.